In the past, there was a profession that was ancient and mysterious, where those who practiced it used their hands to touch things that others did not want to touch, using patience, dedication, and courage to peel back the layers of darkness. And so they applied medical knowledge to work related to the law. The scalpel in their hands was not for healing the sick, but for the deceased to speak, gradually revealing the truth. I stood among them. What is the job of a forensic doctor? Perhaps most would say it can be summed up in 10 words: to bring justice to the dead, to demand rights for the living. In recent years, with the emergence of many literary, cinematic, and television works, the profession of forensic medicine has gradually entered the public eye and is no longer as mysterious as before. As a forensic doctor, I never thought my profession was so sacred. On the contrary, from the moment I stepped into the profession, I always felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. And my colleague, Dr. Trio, passed that mission on to me. Forensic doctors often face negative terms such as death, crime scenes, blood, and violence. They frequently wander on the border between darkness and light. Human life has many random factors, but there is a power in the darkness guiding each person's choices. Sometimes, the encounter at that time is the destiny to meet again later. Becoming a forensic doctor was initially a coincidence, but it seems in the vast world it was predestined. In my childhood memories, there were many beautiful things until the second year of junior high school when I witnessed death with my own eyes. At that time, I was studying at a suburban junior high school. Behind the school was a vast field. Every harvest season, standing on the schoolyard, one could smell the sweet scent wafting from the ripe golden rice fields. One day on the way back to school, the quiet road suddenly became bustling. People were milling about on the path and in the cornfield. "Hey you, come here for a moment." I seemed to hear someone call me as I passed by the crowd, but I didn't dare to look around to confirm. In such a vague situation, I just wanted to quickly return to school. "Hey kid, I'm talking to you." I turned around and saw a tall, middle-aged man in military-style clothing with a serious expression that made me very anxious. I recognized him as a police officer because the police station near my house also wore similar attire. I obediently took a few steps back and stopped about a meter away from the man. "Are you a student of Van Dong High School?" The man pointed to the wall surrounding the school not far away. I nodded, not speaking, and softly saying, "Yes," with a nasal tone. "Do you often walk through here?" The black-skinned policeman looked at me with a somewhat cold gaze. I didn't really like how he spoke, so I nodded again. At this point, another police officer of shorter stature came over, holding a notebook in his hand. He exchanged a few words with the other person and signaled to me, "Come with us." At that moment, I didn't think much, so I followed them into the cornfield to an empty plot. It was called empty, but in reality, the ground was covered with trampled corn stalks. 5 people surrounded, 2 sitting and 3 standing. Hearing movement, they quickly turned to look at me, not knowing what was going on, but the next moment, I witnessed a scene that perhaps I could never forget in my life. Peering through the gap, I saw a naked person lying sprawled on the ground. That person didn't have fair skin, but looked robust and healthy. After a few seconds, I realized that it was a dead person, but my mind still didn't fully awaken. The buzzing of flies echoed in my ears. A man in plain clothes with a camera in hand approached and said, "Lift up your leg." His words carried a commanding tone. I didn't know why I had to lift my leg, but I still obeyed and raised my right knee. "Move straight ahead." I moved my knee straight. "No, keep lifting it higher." I strained to raise my right leg, losing balance, falling to the ground, and grimacing. "What's going on here?" A middle-aged man stepped forward, speaking to the man with the camera. "Look, you're scaring the kid over there." He pointed towards me, but then pulled back his hand involuntarily. I saw he wore a pair of gloves with yellowish-red stains all over. He was tall, with a square face, big eyes, thick eyebrows, and seemed much gentler than the others. I didn't dare to look at him for too long, just bowed my head, seeing he wore a pair of black leather shoes covered in mud. "Don't be afraid. I'm a forensic doctor from the police department. We just want to talk to you to gather some information." His tone was gentle. His face smiled, making me no longer feel frightened. After that, I cooperated to collect fingerprints and footprints, step by step determining the identity of the victim. The measured person looked very familiar, seemed to be a nearby resident, but I didn't know his name. All I remember is the person lying on the ground had a pale face, devoid of vitality. It was different from the deceased in my previous imagination. His eyes were closed, rather than staring wide open. It was the first time I saw a corpse with my own eyes. It wasn't as scary as I imagined. It was also the first time I saw a real forensic doctor, someone who always smiled, was gentle, and amiable. When I entered high school, some classmates would discuss a Hong Kong TV series called Forensic Heroes. Until now, I still haven't watched this series, but it really had an impact on me. The story of your journey from witnessing a case at high school to deciding to become a forensic doctor is truly a fascinating one. Back then, we high school students didn't really know what forensic doctors did. We only knew they dealt with death, looked cool, and the portrayal of forensic doctors in movies was entirely new to us. From then on, I gradually formed a vague idea about the forensic medicine profession. It played a crucial role when I filled out my application form. Mystery, intrigue, and fascination. That's how I felt about forensic medicine initially. My father and uncle were both doctors, and most of our extended family members were in the medical field. I was deeply interested in medicine since childhood and often sneaked into my father's study to read his books. Moreover, my dream was to become a doctor myself. If nothing changed, I would continue the legacy of those before me, donning the white coat and saving lives. A surprise came when filling out my application. My high school graduation scores were relatively good, and my first choice was the prestigious medical university. My second and third choices were colleges related to medicine. There was no doubt I would become a doctor. However, when selecting a major, I briefly glanced at the forensic medicine line. At that time, there were very few universities in the country offering this field. A bold idea suddenly popped into my mind. I thought of the tall figure and gentle smile of the forensic doctor from back then. After consulting my parents, I added forensic medicine to my list of major choices. My father mentioned that he had interacted with forensic doctors before and didn't oppose my decision. He would respect my choice. A month later, I became a student of forensic medicine at a university in the South. The city and the university were unfamiliar, especially the new major, which made me curious about everything. In the first class, the teacher proudly told us that if we considered the overall strength of medical universities, our school could be ranked in the top 4. Also, concerning the strengths of forensic medicine, it was also among the top in the 6 universities of medical schools. The 6 universities were the 6 medical universities that first opened forensic medicine majors nationwide. Hearing the teacher speak, I, who naively chose to pursue a master's degree in forensic medicine, was among the students laughing. I was captivated by that lecture hall that day. The teacher talked about cases from the O.J. Simpson trial to domestic cases. It further convinced me that my choice was correct. Upon graduation, I chose to return to my hometown. On the day of reporting to the agency, I met the friendly forensic doctor again, whom I only knew recently to be Dr. Trio. When Dr. True stopped and looked at me, I had already recognized him long ago, as I had thought of meeting him again when deciding to return. Afterward, I quickly integrated into the work. He said I was the only new forensic doctor who could independently perform post-mortem examinations. For me, it was an honor and a challenge. 10 years later, Dr. Triu's appearance hadn't changed much. He was still tall, gentle, with thick eyebrows and big eyes. I knew he suspected, but he probably didn't recognize me yet. Anyway, my appearance had changed a lot, and he might not remember me from back then. Dr. Trio said he remembered clearly that time when we selected a student to identify the body, never expecting it to be me. He said that initially, when the colleagues from the Criminal Investigation Division saw me passing by near the crime scene, they suspected that I was snooping around the police station. So they took me to the scene and asked the technicians to check for footprints and fingerprints. You couldn't blame them for that. It's just the nature of the job, Dr. Trio sighed. We technicians become more suspicious over time. The man lying on the ground had stayed in my mind for a long time. I still kept an eye on the case back then, wondering who he was, how he died, and who the culprit was. Though not actively asking, he told me about that case. On that morning, Trio was writing an autopsy report in his office when a technician came to inform him that a body had been found in the cornfield next to Vandong High School, and he needed to go to the scene urgently. The victim lay on the ground, surrounded by buzzing flies, with distant bird calls echoing. Although the body was in the cornfield, this wasn't the first crime scene. We didn't find signs of struggle or any weapons around the body, Dr. Trio said. The body wasn't far from the road, and we also found a crushed bicycle nearby. You also saw the body. What do you think caused his death? Dr. Trio smiled and asked me. I closed my eyes and reminisced for a few seconds. From the outside of the body, there seemed to be a lump on his head, indicating signs of head trauma. As for the body, I couldn't bear to look back then. Good job. I thought you didn't remember anything, he nodded. From the autopsy, I found that the victim had many areas of subcutaneous bleeding on the head, a fractured skull. Inside the skull, there was evidence of bleeding. What do you think caused these injuries? Finally, I realized that Dr. Trio was testing my basic knowledge. I was somewhat annoyed. After all, I had become a real forensic doctor. In cases of head trauma, blunt weapons are primarily considered. Combined with the presence of a bicycle at the scene, the first thing to consider is robbery or a traffic accident, I replied before giving myself a way out. After all, I didn't participate in the examination. The actual situation still depends on the scene and the body. But right after that, my retreat was intercepted by Dr. Trio. He stood up and walked out for a moment, then returned with a stack of documents. He opened the case file, found some autopsy photos, and placed them in front of me. There was a photo of flies hovering around the body. Dr. Trio explained that there were many flies swarming around the corpse at that time. He instructed the local police to buy 2 bottles of insect repellent from a nearby store and spray it all over the body. The flies began to scatter, some staggering and swaying, eventually falling to the ground, ceasing to flap their wings, and their legs twitching. That moment was captured by the technicians examining the evidence. Was it a jasmine-scented insect repellent? I suddenly recalled smelling something odd when I approached the body. It turned out to be the scent of the insect repellent mixed with the smell of blood, decay, and alcohol. Dr. Trio said he couldn't remember what type of insect repellent they purchased, but it was true that the deceased had consumed a large amount of alcohol before his death. As I examined the autopsy photos, Dr. Trio supplemented some autopsy situations that were not clearly visible in the photos. The body was very stiff, with all the joints rigor mortis. The cornea is moderately smooth, the pupils can be seen. I pointed at the photo and said, the time of death is about 12 hours before the examination and about 3 hours before the last meal. The next step was to analyze the cause of death and the tools used in the crime. I knew that I should have had the autopsy report in front of these photos, but I held back and didn't flip through it. The victim's eye sockets were black like panda eyes. 7 ribs were broken, and there were clear tire marks on the clothes. I understood now. This is probably a traffic accident. The victim suffered a head injury, was run over by a vehicle leading to death, and then the body was thrown into the cornfield by the roadside. As I looked up, I caught Dr. Trio's serene gaze. He took a sip of tea, then slowly said, "At that time, everyone thought it was a traffic accident." I was slightly confused, my face flushed. Had I made the wrong judgment? Dr. Trio stood up, clasped his hands behind his back, pacing around the office. Suddenly he stopped, turned to me and said, "At that time, everyone thought I was being stubborn." That evening, technician Xiao Wang presented some footprints, and there were distinct drag marks in the cornfield. This indicated that someone had dragged the body from the roadside into the field. At the same time, a tilted bicycle with signs of damage was found and taken to the police station. Dr. Trio speculated on the time of death based on the phenomenon of the body, estimating it to be around 11 p.m. the previous day. The forensic investigators and the police station cooperated in investigating the nearby residence. That evening, a briefing was held to report the case details. The victim's name was Chu Thang Loi, 43 years old, a local resident. On the night before the incident, he dined with friends at a restaurant near Vandong High School. The three of them finished a liter of liquor, then each went home. But his family didn't see him return, so they were very worried. Communication was not convenient at that time, so his family searched all night. Eventually, they found two people who had been drinking with Chu Thang Loi. They didn't know who told them that he had been hit by a car, so they went to the police station crying and demanding that the heartless driver be caught quickly. At the case briefing, the investigators summarized Chu Thang Loi's situation. He was a small contractor with 7 or 8 people under his command. Recently, he had been working at a construction site in the city. According to acquaintances, Chu Thang Loi had a hot temper, and he would cause trouble when drunk. Technician Xiao Wang talked about the scene investigation, speculating that the vehicle involved in the accident might be a motorcycle based on the tire marks on the victim's clothes. Dr. Trio described the autopsy findings. The deceased suffered head and chest injuries, skull fractures, and broken ribs, but this was not the actual cause of death. As soon as this comment was made, the meeting room became chaotic because everyone had investigated the case as a traffic accident. Even the leaders looked at Dr. Trio with suspicion. Even the victim's family thought it was a traffic accident, so why did Dr. Trio deny it? Dr. Trio hesitated a bit because the situation had not been clarified yet. However, as a forensic doctor, he trusted what he saw with his own eyes. Then, Dr. Trio presented his argument. Although Chu Thang Loi suffered injuries to the eyes and the brain area, the amount of bleeding in the brain was not significant, and in a short period, it was not enough to cause death. Despite many broken ribs and obvious tire marks on the chest, the reactions of the broken rib ends were not very clear. It is likely that these injuries occurred during the respiratory phase, even after death. Strong evidence indicates that the victim had a lot of liquefied food in the trachea, bleeding in the lungs and heart. Dr. Trio paused for a moment, then revealed the true cause of death. Chu Thang Loi died of suffocation. That day, Chu Thang Loi was riding his bike home after drinking when he suddenly fell to the ground, lying on the road and starting to vomit. The vomit flowed back into his trachea, causing suffocation. A motorcycle passed over Chu Thang Loi. The driver, fearing responsibility, dragged him into the cornfield by the roadside and then threw the bicycle nearby. Perhaps the driver didn't expect that when the motorcycle passed, Chu Thang Loi either died or was still breathing. In the meeting room, most colleagues frowned, not because they didn't believe Dr. Trio's conclusion, but because once the cause of death was determined to be suffocation, Chu Thang Loi himself had to bear responsibility for his death, and his family would surely not accept it. The team captain pondered for a while. "Old Trio, are you sure?" Dr. Trio nodded and made a surprising conclusion. The victim may have been injured before death, as there were bruises around the eye sockets. Panda eyes, the name says it all. That's the area of bruising around a person's eyes, which could be due to severe lack of sleep or trauma. The soft tissue around the eyes is loose, making it easy to accumulate blood after bleeding. There are types of trauma besides bruising around the face caused by skull fractures. Also, direct impact to the eye area can cause this phenomenon. The base of the victim's nose was also injured, probably due to direct external force. Moreover, the crack on the skull requires a fairly long time to cause bruising around the eyes. It cannot be formed in a short time. Both the base of the nose and the eye sockets are deep recesses. Generally, they are not injured in falls or traffic accidents. Except for cases that have been ruled out, it is certain that he was beaten. Based on this, Dr. Trio concluded that the injuries to the victim's eyes and nose were caused by direct violent blows, but they were not life-threatening injuries. According to his presentation, the nature of the case suddenly changed from a traffic accident to an unforeseen incident. Then, in a moment, it turned into intentional injury, which was something everyone found hard to accept. The atmosphere in the meeting room was heated again. Was Dr. Trio manipulating the story on purpose? The case became more complex, leaving the present investigators feeling confused. The injuries on the victim's body were extremely complicated. What exactly had Chu Thang Loi gone through before his death? Everyone couldn't argue with Dr. Trio about the forensic examination. In fact, they were all dissatisfied but couldn't refute it. Nevertheless, the driver responsible for the accident needed to be found quickly. At the very least, he had come into contact with the victim, and his subjective negligence might have delayed the victim's rescue. After hearing Dr. Trio's explanation, I realized that the case back then was very complicated. I didn't dare to be careless and quickly flipped through the autopsy photos. Dr. Trio sat silently across from me, occasionally taking a sip of tea. The injuries to the victim's eyes and nose could have been caused by punches. I gently folded the autopsy photos back. Except for the large blood clot under the skin behind the head, the remaining blood clots on the victim are also trauma from punches. Dr. Trio's eyes brightened, then he continued to recount the developments of the case. 2 days later, Truong V. Dong, the driver responsible for the accident, turned himself in. At around 11 p.m. that night, he was riding his motorcycle home. When passing by the cornfield road, he didn't see Chu Thang Loi lying there at all. The motorcycle hit something and stopped. Truong V. Dong then realized that someone was lying on the ground. He shouted several times, but the person remained motionless. He crouched down to check, not knowing whether the person was alive or dead, but the body was still warm. Truong V. Dong thought he had caused the accident. "It's a drunk guy who fell off his bike and accidentally hit by me. It's really bad luck." Truong V. Dong lamented that he was unlucky, but didn't know how to reflect on his mishandling of the situation. Truong V. Dong worked at a local factory and lived a comfortable life. But during that time, luck did not favor him. His elderly mother lay bedridden after a fall, and his wife was hospitalized due to illness. He not only had to take care of his family, but also had to work at the factory, working late into the night every day. Truong V. Dong felt the darkness around him and no pedestrians or vehicles passing by, so he decisively dragged the victim and the bicycle into the middle of the cornfield. I really had no other way. If I got implicated, how would my wife and children be? After the action, he hurriedly rode his motorcycle back home, sweating profusely. But unexpectedly, the person still died. The incident stirred up the village. Under this pressure, he had to turn himself in. Truong V. Dong's confession and the examination result of the motorcycle corroborated Dr. Trio's inference, as when the motorcycle hit Chu Thang Loi, he was lying on the ground. No matter how he was questioned, Truong V. Dong still denied hitting Chu Thang Loi. Dr. Trio had previously examined Truong V. Dong's body and found no new injuries on him. Of course, whether his confession was reliable or not still needed further verification. For now, it couldn't be concluded what role he played in this case. Based on the current situation, everyone was speculating about what happened that night. Although Chu Thang Loi was injured in the eye and brain area, the amount of bleeding in the brain was not significant, not enough to cause death in a short time. Although many ribs were broken and there were tire marks on the chest, the fracture reactions of the broken ribs were not very clear. It is likely that the injury occurred during the respiratory phase, even after death. Strong evidence that the victim had a lot of mashed food in the trachea, bleeding in both the lungs and heart. Dr. Trio paused for a moment, then revealed the true cause of death. Chu Thang Loi died from suffocation. That day, Chu Thang Loi was riding his bicycle home after drinking, then suddenly fell on the road, lying on the ground and starting to vomit. The vomit flowed back into the trachea and caused suffocation. A motorcycle passed by and ran over Chu Thang Loi. The driver, fearing responsibility, pulled him into a nearby cornfield and threw the bicycle nearby. Perhaps the driver also did not expect that when the motorcycle ran over, Chu Thang Loi was either already dead or still breathing. In the meeting room, most colleagues frowned. It's not that they don't believe Dr. Trio's conclusion, but because once the cause of death is determined to be suffocation, Chu Thang Loi himself must take responsibility for his death, and his family would surely be distraught. The team leader pondered for a while. "Old Trio, are you sure?" Dr. Trio nodded and made a surprising conclusion. The victim may have still been injured, as there are bruises around the eye socket. The panda eye, a name that says it all. It's the dark bruising around a person's eyes, which can be caused by severe sleep deprivation or trauma. The soft tissue around the eyes is loose, making it easy to accumulate blood after bleeding. There are types of trauma other than bruising around the face caused by a fractured skull. In addition, direct impact on the eye area can also cause this phenomenon. The base of the victim's nose was also injured, probably due to direct external force. Furthermore, the crack on the skull needs a fairly long time to cause bruising around the eyes, which cannot form in a short time. The base of the nose and eye socket are both deep recesses. Generally, they are not injured in falls or traffic accidents. Apart from the cases that have been ruled out, it's certain that he was beaten. Based on this evidence, Dr. Trieu concluded that the injuries to the victim's eyes and nose were caused by direct violent blows, but they were not fatal injuries. As he presented, the nature of the case suddenly shifted from a traffic accident to an unintended incident. And in an instant, it turned into intentional injury, something everyone found hard to accept. The atmosphere in the meeting room became turbulent, not because Dr. Trieu was intentionally manipulating the story, right? The case became increasingly complex, leaving the present investigators feeling bewildered. The wounds on the victim's body were extremely complicated. So what exactly did Chu Thang Loi go through before his death? No one could argue with Dr. Trieu about the forensic examination, but deep down, they were all skeptical and yet unable to refute it. Nevertheless, it was imperative to quickly find the driver responsible for the accident. At the very least, he had come into contact with the victim, and moreover, there was a possibility of malicious intent, which could have delayed aid to the victim. After listening to Dr. Trieu's explanation, I realized that the case back then was very complex. I couldn't afford to be careless and quickly flipped through the autopsy photos. Dr. Trieu sat quietly across from me, occasionally sipping tea. The injuries to the victim's eyes and nose could have been caused by punching. I gently folded the autopsy photos back. Aside from the large subcutaneous hematoma at the back of the head, the other blood clots on the victim are also trauma from punches. Dr. Trieu's eyes lit up, and he continued. The injuries on the victim's body mainly focus on the facial area, forehead, and head, indicating a taller assailant. He smiled and continued to recount the course of the case. 2 days later, Truong Vidong, the driver responsible for the accident, turned himself in. Around 11 o'clock that night, he was riding his motorcycle home. When passing by the road beside the cornfield, he didn't see Chu Thang Loi lying there. The motorcycle hit something and stopped. Truong Vidong then realized there was a person lying on the ground. He shouted a few times, but the person remained motionless. He then dragged him into the cornfield and threw the bicycle nearby. Truong Vidong probably didn't expect that when the motorcycle passed, Chu Thang Loi was either dead or still breathing. In the discussion, it was concluded that during that crucial time, it was the self-study session in the evening at Van Dong High School. Some speculated that perhaps students walking home along that road had a conflict with Chu Thang Loi. Therefore, the criminal police went to the school to investigate the students passing through that section of the road on the night of the incident. According to the characteristics provided by Dr. Trieu, they found 7 male students over 1.75 meters tall. The 7 male students were brought to the school meeting room. Among them was a thin, white-skinned student with a distracted gaze and unnatural expression. When the investigators suggested bringing Trin Chi Kiet in for questioning, the teacher was very surprised and suspicious, as Trin Chi Kiet was an outstanding student. Excellence does not mean you won't make mistakes. That afternoon, Trin Chi Kiet admitted that he had fought with a drunk person that night. Trin Chi Kiet had been orphaned since childhood and grew up with his mother. To compensate for his love for his son, the mother devoted all her efforts to him. Trin Chi Kiet was also very conscious and tried hard. His academic achievements always ranked at the top. Trin Chi Kiet was actually very stubborn. He was like his mother, valuing academic results immensely. He feared that if he didn't perform well in any subject, his mother would be heartbroken. During that time, Trin Chi Kiet's grades fluctuated. The recent exam was not ideal, and Trin Chi Kiet was under a lot of psychological pressure, always thinking of ways to explain to his mother. That night, due to the teacher being late, Trin Chi Kiet's class had a delayed self-study session. After the evening self-study session, he was the last student to leave the classroom. While riding his bike home, Trinchi Kiet was somewhat absent-minded, his mind swirling with thoughts of exam results. When passing through that section of the road, he collided with another person also riding a bicycle. Both fell to the ground. Trinchi Kiet received an immediate slap in the face when he clumsily got up and was grabbed by the collar, a smell of alcohol emanating from the person. Trinchi Kiet had never experienced such a situation before, his whole body trembling with anger. He wanted to pull the man's hand away, but unexpectedly, he was rough and wouldn't let go. At that time, I was very angry and pushed him away with force, Trinchi Kiet said. After pushing the drunk man, he quickly rode his bike home, and what happened afterwards was unclear. The police investigators felt that Trinchi Kiet seemed unlike he was lying. Could there have been another person involved in the conflict with Chu Thang Loi? At the crucial moment, Dr. Trio played his role well. He went to the interrogation room that day and examined Trinchi Kiet's body. Trinchi Kiet's left face and solar plexus were slightly swollen, his nose slightly crooked, and the bone joints on his fingers were also swollen, with some areas scabbed over, indicating that he had used his fists to impact another object. Dr. Trio diagnosed that the altercation between Trinchi Kiet and the drunk man that night was more severe than what Trinchi Kiet had claimed. In the second interrogation, Trinchi Kiet changed his statement. He said he pushed the drunk man forcefully to the ground. This could explain the head injury of Chu Thang Loi. However, Dr. Trio shook his head after learning about the interrogation situation. We must continue questioning. Although Trinchi Kiet was very intelligent, he was still a young student who couldn't withstand much pressure and confessed everything quickly. During the altercation between the two that night, Chu Thang Loi muttered a phrase, "You bastard!" Trinchi Kiet felt a ringing in his ears at that moment. A surge of anger erupted, and he couldn't contain himself anymore. His mother was his limit, and the drunkard hit the nail on the head. He couldn't compromise. Although taller than Chu Thang Loi, Trinchi Kiet's slim physique didn't give him much of an advantage. During the fight, he received many punches, to the point of bleeding from his nose. But he also didn't care about the pain, only one thought in his head: fight back. The road was not flat, and the drunk man slipped and fell. Trinchi Kiet didn't stop being angry and continued to punch him in the face. Chu Thang Loi lay on the ground, panting heavily, mumbling something in his mouth. Trinchi Kiet couldn't hear clearly, gradually calming down, fearing the drunk man would continue to obstruct him, so he quickly rode his bike home. His caring mother asked why he came home so late. He said he had unfortunately fallen off his bike and sat on the roadside for a while. That night, Trinchi Kiet lay on his bed until dawn before drifting off to sleep. He didn't know that another person on a motorcycle almost took the blame. Dr. Trio said that after the incident was over, Truong V. Dong brought a pennant to the office to express his deep gratitude and pulled out an envelope. Dr. Trio refused, but he almost knelt down to thank him. Dr. Trio was in a difficult position and had to accept the pennant. On a dark autumn night, 3 unfortunate men happened to meet each other. Each had their own reasons for their actions, but in the end, it was a mess of mistakes. In life, not everything depends on fate. Humans can control their own destiny, but unfortunately, it sometimes becomes extremely difficult. I had heard the name Trinchi Kiet before and seen his photos. At that time, each class in the school had an honor board. The students who ranked top in the school were all listed on it. The policeman that year was Mr. Ngo, with a cold exterior but warm inside. He was a master at solving cases in the criminal police division. I'm sure Dr. Trio didn't tell him that the student who appeared at the scene that year was me. The forensic technician told me to lift my legs. His name was Mr. Vuong, and he also didn't remember the incident from that year. He was diligent and responsible in his work, sometimes paying attention to trivial matters, but fundamentally a kind-hearted person. In the following years, Dr. Trio and I became harmonious colleagues. I learned a lot from him and felt that he wanted to pass on his career to me. Dr. Trio was a respectable person, but unfortunately, our time working together was not long-lasting. I miss him and will always remember that afternoon, his smile, kindness, and amiability.